Sure, you could say someone is motivated psychologically to be a believer, but heck, I think you can be just as motivated psychologically to be a non-believer. But I think indeed, objectively, what happens if God is dead is you have a moral and metaphysical chaos.
Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I'm Brandon Vogt, the Senior Publishing Director. Today we continue our series of discussions looking at four massively influential figures who together help explain our present moment, how we got to where we are in the culture today. Today's figure is Friedrich Nietzsche, the German philosopher and cultural critic. And to discuss him is His Excellency Bishop Robert Barron, new bishop of the Diocese of Winona, Rochester, in Minnesota. Bishop, it's good to be with you.
Hey, Brandon, good to see you.
You recently, I think this was maybe about a month ago by the time this episode airs, ordained some Dominicans out in San Francisco. Talk about that.
Loved it. Yeah, it's a great privilege, obviously. The great privilege of being a bishop is to ordain men to the priesthood. I think I've ordained, 11 or 12 fellows now, including the first ones I ordained were Dominicans on the East Coast in Washington. And then the Western province invited me. And I ordained these three wonderful fellows. I met them the morning of the ordination. We had breakfast together. And then it took place at a gorgeous church in San Francisco. I'd been there many years before, called St. Dominic's. It's like Chartres. I mean, it's beautiful, beautiful stained glass windows all over. Wonderful church. The liturgy was done in a very stately, beautiful way. The music was amazing. The chance to preach, and then ordain these three young Dominicans. Then afterwards, we crossed over the bridge to Oakland because their priory is over there, St. Albert the Great Priory, which I had visited many, many years before. I gave a lecture there, I remember, a long time ago. And we had just a wonderful reception out in the yard there and loved it. It's just one of the great privileges of my life.
Well, let's turn now to Nietzsche. Back in 2020, you posted a video of a talk that you had given titled Ideas Have Consequences, the Philosophers Who Shaped Our Time. That was a talk that you originally gave to the Knights of Malta at their national conference. And you were addressing this somewhat convulsive time in our history demonstrated by the global pandemic, riots in our streets, unstable politics, outbursts of unrest. We've all seen it. We all know what I'm talking about there. But you showed how these ideologies that undergird much of this unrest stem in large part from four influential figures, and they are Karl Marx, Friedrich Nietzsche, Jean-Paul Sartre, and Michel Foucault. You claimed that once we understand these figures and some of their most basic ideas, we'll see them everywhere. We'll see their influence everywhere, and more importantly, be better prepared to engage it. I think we were surprised at how popular that talk became.
Super
it has
surprised.
Almost a million views.
I know.
So what we thought was, and we do a series here on the Word on Fire show where we do a deeper dive into each of these four figures. So in the last episode, we covered Karl Marx, and today we will do Friedrich Nietzsche. So let's start with the basics. Who was Nietzsche? What should we know about the man before we get to his ideas?
He was a very interesting, peculiar figure. Born 1844, dies 1900. So basically his life is the second half of the 19th century. As you can tell, he didn't live very long. And in fact, the last 10 years of his life were lived in basically insanity. He had we're not sure what happened to him exactly, but some combination of dementia, psychological illness, physical breakdown, which happened when he was about 46, and he lived another 10 years, but completely unproductive. And so he had a very short life, really, a very short career, but man, did he punch above his weight in terms of influence. Peculiar also in this way, I mean, Nietzsche was the son of a Protestant person, so he had a religious, background. He was a bit of a genius, kind of a prodigy, and as a young man, he becomes a student of philology and then becomes, I believe at the University of Basel, the youngest professor of philology in the history of that institution. So he was a man of language. He loved the classical world, Greek and Latin and the classical languages. But Nietzsche was never able really to hold down a job very long. He was always quirky, strange in his personal habits and so on. So he was a professor for a while, but not for that long. He lived a kind of itinerant life as a as a freelance philosopher, you might say, supported by various, friends and wealthy people. And he wrote a series of books that have proven to be massively influential on the 20th century. Think of Heidegger, think of Carl Jung, think of Michel Foucault, Jean-Paul Sartre. All were profoundly influenced by Friedrich Nietzsche. A darker side, certainly some of the Nazis were influenced by Nietzsche. Is that fair to him? There's a big argument there. Many say no, that he himself would not have sympathized with that. But certainly some of the Nazis took Nietzsche seriously. To this day, heck, in this studio, not many months ago, we had a wonderful conversation with an American scholar who sees the influence of Nietzsche throughout, even beginning in the 19th century, but then throughout the 20th century, Nietzsche's influence today. So, a peculiar, quirky, late 19th century figure who's really punched above his weight in terms of influence.
One of Nietzsche's most famous ideas is the death of God. We find that in one of his novels, also Sprach Zarathustra, in which one of the characters says, God is dead and we killed him. What did Nietzsche mean by this?
Well, that's much debated too. Was he acknowledging with many people at that time, let's say some mid-19th century, moving to later 19th century, that at least the classical idea of God wouldn't hold water, that it's not intellectually defensible. And so this foundational idea behind ethics, behind politics, behind society, behind everything, this idea of God, was collapsing. And was that a cry that you're quoting there from Also Sprach Zarathustra, was that a cry of exultation or a cry of anguish? God is dead, we killed him, let's move on, with great human achievement. Or, and this is Jordan Peterson's reading, it was more of a cry of anguish and despair, that God is dead, and therefore what can we do? What's left? If you kick the foundation out from everything, what's going to follow? And will nihilism follow? Will a sort of, despairing, relativistic, anything goes-ism prevail? So that's the question. Is that a cry of exultation or a cry of despair? And I think, the atheists take it as the former. I kind of side more with the Peterson reading that it's a prophetic cry of, boy, what's going to happen now? And furthermore, some claim, Nietzsche effectively predicted what would happen in the 20th century. Think of the outrages of the 20th century. In many ways, the worst century on record in terms of the piling up of corpses. Well, what happens when God is dead? Nazism, communism, Pol Pot, Mao, and Stalin, and Hitler. So was Nietzsche, in his kind of dark way, prophesizing what would happen in the 20th century?
Let's stay on that for a little bit longer. And I'll ask you, if God were dead, what would be the consequences?
The 20th century. I agree with that if there's no God, it's like the Dostoevsky line, if there's no God, then anything is permitted. Yeah. That's why, Brandon, it's interesting how often atheists will invoke the Feuerbach principle, which is, well, you religious people, it's just a lot of, wish-fulfilling fantasy. It's a subjective desire, if God exists, then I can live forever and be ultimately happy. But see, I'll turn that right around on them and say, no, I think atheism is a wish-fulfilling fantasy. If there's no God, then it's up to me. I can do whatever I want. As long as I don't get caught, I don't upset too many people, I can do whatever I want. It's a pathway to ultimate liberation, And so I think those two just cancel each other out if you want. That sure, you could say someone is motivated psychologically to be a believer, but heck, I think you can be just as motivated psychologically to be a non-believer. But I think indeed, objectively, what happens if God is dead is you have a moral and metaphysical chaos.
That calls to mind a quote from the English mathematician John Lennox. He noted how Stephen Hawking had said that religion is a fairy tale for people who are afraid of the dark. And Lennox responded, "Atheism is a fairy tale for those afraid of the light." I always thought that was delicious.
Amen. No, that's exactly right. He's good, isn't he, Lennox? I read a couple. He has a nice little book called "Can Science Explain Everything?" I think it's called. Very good. He's coming up out of the scientific tradition and is also a firm believer. So anyway, he's good.
Let's turn back to Nietzsche. Another of his famous concepts is the will to power. What is this all about?
Well, I think it follows from the first. If God is dead, God's out of the picture. Objective value's out of the picture too, and that's a key idea for Nietzsche, that we're beyond good and evil, right? These values that we hang on to, well, those are just, power plays, or those are impositions from people who want to maintain their domination. So if all that's gone, what's left? Well, what's left is the will to power, that I assert my authority, I assert my dominance, and Nietzsche wants these heroic figures to claim their prerogative and to claim this identity. Don't let society, cow you into thinking you're just, a little nobody or you belong in your place. No, the heroic Ubermensch, he calls them, right? Superman, it means literally, Uber means over, Mensch is human. It's the overman, the man beyond the ordinary, right? The Ubermensch should assert his authority, should assert his power. Why, you ask, are so many people today obsessed with the issue of power? That goes right back to Friedrich Nietzsche. Behind Nietzsche, too, is the philosopher Schopenhauer. And he made one of these moves that's very basic, is eschewing intellect in favor of will. And that's that old issue of voluntarism. That goes way back, right through the Middle Ages to ancient times. When you stress the will over mind, trouble ensues. That's, for me, one of the basic things. It's like nominalism or Gnosticism. When those things, rise up, trouble will come. Voluntarism that privileges the will over mind. Nietzsche, in some ways, is a pure expression of that kind of voluntarism. But now it's not so much God's will, because God's dead, but it's now my will, because I'm in the position of God. And so it's the voluntarist God of the Middle Ages, let's say of people like Occam, but now transposed into a human key. And so it's the godlike Ubermensch that Nietzsche valorizes. He sort of sings the virtues of the Ubermensch. Power relationships. Who has it? Who wants it? Whose voice is not being heard? Why are so many people today kind of asserting themselves, asserting their powerful voice and will? A lot of that is traceable back to Nietzsche, I think.
Nietzsche was famously harsh toward Christian morality. He described it as slave morality.
Slave.
Yeah, why was he so negative toward Christian ethics?
Well, that's the giveaway. See, if you're a slave, so you've got no power, and the Ubermensch, the guy that has you under control, he's really something. You're like the sort of pathetic character that you have no power. What are you going to advocate? Oh, you should love your enemy. You should be kind to those on the margins. You should be good to those who have no power. So it's a kind of morality he thought of resentment. It's the resentment of the slave who doesn't have anything. And he resents the powerful people. And so he imposes upon them the moral obligation to be kind and gentle to the poor slobs who don't have any power. And Nietzsche's is more like this, tough guy morality of don't play that game of slavish resentment and all this language of love and compassion and the poor and the marginalized. That's a slave morality of resentment. He wants this heroic morality of the Ubermensch. You see a little bit now why some of the Nazis found this attractive. Whenever you talk about like a master race and then these other races that really aren't up to it. And well, wait a minute, you can't be killing these people. This is so cruel and unkind. Is that the slave morality that the Ubermensch wants to eschew? Now, again, I want to be careful. I don't want somebody to say Nietzsche equals Nazi. That's not fair. But I think you can see why some of those early Nazis found things in Nietzsche that were attractive to them.
Let's talk more about his conception of the Ubermensch, the Superman or the Overman, as some translators have it. To me, it's kind of the convergence of these three major ideas we've been discussing, namely the death of God, the will
Yeah.
to power, religion, the rejection of slave
Yeah.
morality. They all
That's right.
kind of come together in his conception of the Ubermensch. Talk more about
Right.
that.
Well, that's it. I think that's exactly the right way to put it. It's the end result of all this musing. So if all these things are true, what's the end result is this heroic figure. And so Nietzsche sings that figure, and he encourages people to move into that space. So I think that's right, Brandon, what you just said, that it's the summation in some ways. It's the ethical outcome of the more metaphysical musing of Nietzsche. One thing about Nietzsche that's interesting, boy, is he a good writer. I'll give him that. He tends to write aphoristically. So Nietzsche doesn't write lengthy treatises for the most part, or like a Summa Theologiae. He writes in little aphoristic bursts that are often very memorable. And of course, the translations don't do justice to them, but he's seen as a great master of German prose. And that, I think a lot of his power comes from that too, that people are able to seize upon these very witty and catchy aphorisms. But I think you're right, that the three more fundamental ideas give rise to this ethical outcome of the Ubermensch. Now, you could say, yeah, but what's the Ubermensch supposed to be doing? Well, see, that's up to him, because we're beyond good and evil. Now we take a little short step to Jean-Paul Sartre, don't we? Is existence precedes essence. Well, what is the good life? How should I live? Don't let anyone tell you about that. You decide. You decide. Well, and Brandon, can you hear from Nietzsche's Ubermensch through Sartre's existential man right to almost every teenager in America today, right? There's a very straight line, it seems to me. The teenager today saying, who are you to tell me what to do? I got my voice. I decide the meaning of my life. That is traceable right back to Nietzsche.
Let's put Nietzsche's Ubermensch in conversation with Catholicism. One thing that struck me when I read Nietzsche is how there are some similarities between the Ubermensch and the Catholic conception of a saint. For example, Nietzsche says that to be great, you have to give up trying to fit into a dull society. You have to give up attachment to material things. But how does the Ubermensch and the saint differ? Where's the divide?
No, that's good. That's helpful. And keep in mind, he did have a Christian background, and he was operating within a Christian thought world. And yes, the heroism, I would say they have in common. We refer to a saint as someone of heroic virtue. And yes, indeed, a saint is someone who's risen above the average, view of things. But for Nietzsche, the average view of things might be an ordinary kind of bland Christianity, and you want to rise above that to a heroic, self-assertive stance. Where for the Christian, it's rising above sin, right? You rise above the sinful way of being, which is self-absorbed and self-preoccupied. And I can see with Nietzsche, too, a kind of detachment thing. Like, don't get caught up in these, things that will draw you into a more mundane life, but strive for this heroic life. And the Christian would say, sure, be detached from worldly goods that are not the same as the supreme good, so you can live according to God's purpose. So yeah, there's something similar there. And yeah, are the saints a kind of Ubermenschen in the spiritual order? Yeah, in a way. Maybe you'd even say they're imbued with the supernatural life of grace, and that makes them a kind of Ubermensch, like beyond the ordinary. So yeah, I think there's something there.
Nietzsche is often accused of leading his followers into nihilism and despair. It's kind of a trope. I know a lot of people in college who discovered Nietzsche, read him, and then thought, well, what's the point? There's no meaning in life anymore, and life is terrible. Is this a fair criticism? And if so, is it a reason to reject his main ideas, kind of a reductio ad absurdum?
Yeah, I see the link to Sartre all the time, because Sartre said, "La vie est absurde." Life is absurd, meaning it has no meaning. We're all going to die. Nothing we do here really, certainly won't last forever. The planet will eventually just, be burned up by the sun, and then the universe will fade away. So there is no objective morality. There is no objective ultimate meaning. What they both do, though, in the face of that, is not to succumb to despair, but to assert oneself. So the existentialist man is the one who, despite the absurdity of the world, nevertheless says, but I'm going to stand, let's say, against the Nazis, or I'm going to stand for this. Same with Nietzsche, I think. You know, the Ubermensch, even though there is nothing objective that grounds my life, or there's no standard against which I'm going to measure my life, but I'm going to assert myself in a heroic way. I'm going to find what I want to do. See, but my problem with, I'm reading Sartre on that. Sartre, some say, was himself involved in the resistance, against the Nazis. Okay, but what if you're a convinced Nazi and you say, what I stand for is putting Jews to death and building the Third Reich? Well, how do we judge between the two if there's no objective morality? So the Sartrean, Ubermensch is for the resistance. The Nazi Ubermensch is for the Third Reich. Well, okay, Ubermenschen, how do we decide which of you is right? And I don't think we can on Sartrean grounds, and I don't think you really can on Nietzschean grounds. There you have assertive wills. And again, now may I say, what do you see today? You go on a college campus. Do you see a lot of people arguing with each other, or do you see a lot of self-assertive wills claiming prerogatives and claiming power and claiming the right to speak? But are we appealing to a common ground to say, I think that position is relatively right and that one's relatively wrong? No. How dare you tell me that? I've got my, right, and you've got your right. The result, in my judgment, is the war of all against all. Is when you lose the objective in terms of the epistemic and the moral, what you're left with is just a constant battlefield of self-assertive wills. I do think that's a legacy of Nietzsche.
Let's close with this question. I asked you about this in regards to Marx, and I think I'll ask it in regards to these other three figures, but what do you think Nietzsche gets right, and then what in his thought should we resist?
Well, I think when he gets right, what we said, that with the death of God is going to come this sort of disconcerting, anxiety-filled state of mind. God is dead and we've killed him, and that's a very dire prospect. He gets that right, for sure. What he gets wrong, it seems to me, and it's related there, is the suspension of the objective in terms of value. When that goes, then the rest of the thing collapses, and it collapses into a self-assertive subjectivism. And that has led to a lot of the conflictual quality of our conversation today. So I think he gets that wrong. And like all the great atheists, Brandon, and I've said this for years, they construe God as a competitor to our flourishing and our freedom. And so I think Nietzsche saw that, like so many of the atheists of the last couple of centuries. God threatens my freedom, threatens my autonomy, and the true God does not. The God who's not a competitive supreme being, but being itself. I think if Nietzsche had read more Aquinas and understood him, he might have resisted this tendency to demonize God as a rival to our flourishing. That, if the glory of God is a human being fully alive, Irenaeus, right? Well, then why not be an Ubermensch? Okay, I'm good with that. I'm down with that. That you be the greatest person you can be, and God is going to smile on that. God makes that possible. God loves that. It's not like I've got to assert myself over and against an imposing deity. But the glory of God is an Ubermensch, right? The glory of God is a human being fully realized. If Nietzsche had read more Irenaeus, he might have avoided some of these pitfalls.
Well, it's time now for our question from one of our listeners. Every episode, we take one question from someone who is inquiring about a theological or philosophical topic. Today, we are taking a question from Reed. Reed is in Houston and is asking about a couple of the theological virtues. Here's Reed.
Hi, Bishop Barron. My name is Reed Linden, and I'm a high school theology teacher here in Houston, Texas. I was hoping that you could distinguish between the theological virtues of faith and hope. Often when I hear you talk about faith, I hear you talk about trusting in God, and that is exactly what I have always understood hope to be. So if you could clarify that for me, I sure would appreciate it. Thank you for your ministry. Bye.
Yeah, thanks for that. So you're looking at the three great theological virtues of faith, hope, and love. Here's Aquinas on it. So faith is the opening of the door to the spiritual life. Faith is an ordering of one's life to God. And so in that sense, trusting in God. It's walking through the door that God has opened to his own life, which is why faith is required for everything. Why I can't please God without faith, as the Bible says. But Aquinas would say, you can't have a spiritual life without faith. Faith is the foundation. It's the opening of the door. It's I'm now living my life in the presence of God. What's hope? Hope is an orientation toward eternal life as your final good. So I move through life with all kinds of proximate goods, like right now the good of talking to Brandon. Later in the day, I've got other goods I'm pursuing. But it's very interesting that often when I pray, this comes to me. But the ultimate good that I'm shooting for beyond and among all these other ones is the good of eternal life. Notice how our prayer so often ends with that we're ultimately praying for heaven, to be in the patria, to be in the homeland, that to ultimately be at the banquet with you, O Lord, in heaven. So hope orients my life to that end, right? And then love is the heart of it, because love is what God is. Faith opens the door. Hope brings me through the door and orders me to the final end. But what is that final end? Love, because love is what God is. And so as, again, the Aquinas says, in heaven, faith fades away. I don't need faith in heaven because I have vision. Secondly, hope fades away because I've attained my final end. But love doesn't fade away because that's what heaven is. And that's why Paul gave us that, the three things that last, faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love, because that's the one that doesn't fade away even in heaven. So I would do it that way with your students maybe.
Well, thanks for the question, Reed. If you have a question you'd like to send to Bishop Barron, do so at the website askbishopbarron.com. As we wrap up the show here, I wanted to announce an upcoming conference being hosted by our Word on Fire Institute. It's called Wonder, a conference on faith and science. Faith and science. It's something we discuss all the time here on the podcast, and we finally decided to have a big event centered on this issue. It's happening January 13th and 14th, 2023, so 4 months from now, in Grapevine, Texas, which is just outside of Dallas-Fort Worth. You can find more at the website wonderconference.com. What the conference is going to do is bring together recognized experts in the fields of physics, philosophy, theology, technology, and history, all to bridge this perceived gap between faith and science. The conference is made possible by the generous support and the ongoing grant of our friends at the John Templeton Foundation. We're so grateful to the Templeton folks. They do so much good in the world, and this conference is just one more example. So find out more, sign up at the website wonderconference.com. Well, thanks so much for watching and listening, and we'll see you next time on the Word on Fire show.